There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a ranch when the dying has started. Not the quiet of early morning before the hands are up and the coffee's on. Not the peaceful hush of a Sunday when the wind lays down and the grass just stands there, breathing. This is a different silence, heavier, thicker, the kind that presses against your ears like wool soaked in water. The kind where you walk past a pen and notice the calves aren't making noise, and for one terrible second you think maybe they've all recovered, maybe the fever broke overnight. And then you look closer. I've worked ranching country for going on 19 years. I've ridden fence lines in 3 states. I've seen drought years and flood years, and one hailstorm that turned an alfalfa field into gravel in under 4 minutes. I've watched grown men with calluses thick as boot leather and eyes that hadn't shown moisture since boyhood, drop to one knee in a pasture and put a hand on a dead calf and just stay there. Just stay. But I had never, in all those years, seen anything like what hit the Cimarron Basin in the autumn of 1887. They called it the pale fever. Some called it the walking rot, which was worse and probably more accurate. It came from the south, people said, carried on the same trade winds that brought the cattle drives up through the nations. It moved through herds like a rumor moves through a bunkhouse, quietly at first, then all at once, then catastrophically. One morning a rancher would notice a calf standing apart from the rest, head low, breathing wrong. 2 days later, that calf would be dead. 3 days after that, a third of the herd would be dying beside it. The territorial losses that fall were staggering. I've seen the ledgers. I've talked to the men who kept them with their ink-stained fingers and their haunted accountant eyes. In a 40-mile radius of Bitter Creek, over 11,000 head of cattle died between September and November of that year. Ranchers who had spent decades building bloodlines watched their entire legacy collapse in a matter of weeks. Banks foreclosed. Families left. Some men simply disappeared, rode out one morning and never came back, which in that country at that time meant one of several things, none of them good. And in the middle of all of it, on a hardpan quarter section of land that nobody had wanted in the first place, a 26-year-old Apache woman named Dea bought 70 sick calves for $6 and a pair of her late father's blankets. Every rancher in the basin thought she was insane. Most of them would be dead broke before the first snow. And her calves, every single one of them, would survive. What I'm about to tell you, I didn't witness all of it myself. Some of it I learned from Dea directly, in that careful, measured way she had of speaking, like every word cost her something she decided ahead of time she could afford. Some of it I pieced together from other sources. An old Apache man named Chisovi who'd known her since she was small, a Tejano hand named Abelino who'd worked a neighboring spread that season, and my own notes, which I kept in a leather journal I'd bought in Tucson and had been filling imperfectly since the spring. I have a habit of writing things down, always have. My mother called it a nervous tic dressed up as scholarship. She wasn't wrong. But it meant that when something extraordinary happened in front of me, I had somewhere to put it, which is the closest thing to understanding that I've ever managed. This is what I put down. The first time I saw Dea, she was standing in the middle of a pen of dying calves, and she was counting them. Not the way a buyer counts livestock, quickly, with professional detachment, running a trained eye down the rows of backs and flanks and making rapid calculations about weight and yield and market value. She was counting them slowly. One hand moving through the air in front of her, finger extended, touching each animal in the space between them without contact, like she was numbering something sacred. Her lips moved but made no sound I could hear. It was the 3rd week of September. The sky that morning had the particular quality of early autumn in high desert country, a blue so clear and hard it looked like something you could scratch your name into, the sun at a low angle that turned everything it touched to hammered copper. The Bledsoe stock auction yard smelled of fresh manure and old fear, and the particular sweetness of sick animals, which is a smell I've never been able to describe accurately except to say that it sits in the back of your throat and stays there. I was there on business of my own. I worked as a ledger man for a ranching syndicate out of Denver, which meant I traveled the basin counties every autumn tallying what existed against what had been promised, and that season I had already stopped writing numbers down and started writing eulogies. The fever had arrived ahead of me. Half my client operations had collapsed before I could reach them. I was documenting losses with the grim efficiency of a battlefield surgeon, not to save anything, but to establish a record that the dying had happened at all. The auction that day was peculiar. The yard operator, a leathery Missourian named Prentice Boak, had decided, with the desperate ingenuity of a man watching his livelihood evaporate, to hold a clearance sale for the condemned stock. The healthy cattle had already been pulled weeks ago, quarantined or sold or moved to higher ground by ranchers trying to outrun the pale fever's advance. What remained in Boak's pens were the animals that nobody had bothered to move, because nobody thought it was worth the trouble. Sick calves, 73 of them, most showing early to mid-stage fever symptoms, clouded eyes, labored breathing, the distinctive swaying gait that the hands had taken to calling the fever walk. 3 more were already dead in the corner pen and hadn't been removed yet. Boak had tacked a handwritten sign to the fence post that read, "Mixed lot, sick stock, no guarantees, buyer ASSUMES all risk." Below it, someone had added in pencil, "God help you." There were maybe a dozen men standing around the perimeter of that pen, and their expressions ranged from morbid curiosity to the specific blank-eyed exhaustion of people who have been watching catastrophe unfold for so long that catastrophe has become their new normal. A few were ranchers I recognized, men who'd lost portions of their own herds and had come to the auction the way people return to the scene of an accident, searching for something they can't name. Nobody was bidding. The lot had been sitting there for over an hour. And then there was Dea. I noticed her for the obvious reason first. She was the only woman in the yard, and the only Apache in a space otherwise occupied exclusively by white men and one Tejano hand. She wore a cotton work shirt faded to the color of old rope, canvas trousers that had been mended at both knees with leather patches, and boots that had seen considerable geography. Her hair was black and thick, and pulled back with a strip of trade cloth, and she had her father's blankets folded over her left arm, heavy wool Navajo-style work, red and black geometric patterns, the kind of blanket that represented weeks of skilled weaving and was worth more than most people in that yard were carrying in cash. She was not young in the way that makes people underestimate youth. She had the kind of stillness that takes years to develop, not passivity, but containment, the difference between a river and a dam. She counted all 70 remaining calves, then she counted them again. Then she walked to where Prentice Boak was standing with his arms crossed, and his expression set to the factory default of an auctioneer presiding over a loss, and she asked him what he wanted for the lot. I was close enough to hear the exchange. I want to be precise about this because the particulars matter. Boak looked at her for a moment with the reflexive wariness that men of his type and generation applied to Apache people as a default setting, not quite hostility, but a careful blankness that left room for it. Then he looked at the pen of sick calves. Then he looked back at her. "Lady," he said, and the word came out with the particular flatness of a man who is not sure which kind of disrespect he's attempting. "Those animals are going to be dead inside a week. Most of them won't last 3 days. "I know what they are," Dea said. Her English was precise and deliberate, accented in a way that I later learned came from having been taught by a mission teacher in her childhood, formal, careful, each word placed with intention. "What is the price?" Boak named no figure. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, except it was too tired to be funny. "I was going to pay a man $2 to haul them off and bury them tomorrow." "I will take them for $6 and these blankets," Dea said. She held the folded blankets out slightly, not as an offering, but as a statement, an accounting. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a social script breaks down, and nobody has the next page. Boak stared at the blankets. They were exceptional work. Even someone with no particular knowledge of weaving could see that. The geometric precision, the weight of the wool, the dye quality. In any trading post in the territory, those blankets would have fetched $8 to $12 apiece, easy. "You want to buy dying calves," Boak said slowly, "with $20 of blankets and $6 cash." $26 to $28 total value, yes, Dea said. "Paid today." Another silence. "Miss," said one of the ranchers at the fence, a big raw-boned man from the Sweetwater drainage whose name I later learned was Hargreave, and who had that week watched 60 head of his own cattle die. "Those calves are going to die. Every last one. There ain't a thing you or anybody else can do about it." Dea looked at him with an expression I struggled to classify at the time. It wasn't contempt. It wasn't pity. It was something more considered, the expression of a person who has heard a thing stated as fact that they know from experience to be uncertain. "Perhaps," she said. "Boak sold her the lot." I wrote it in my ledger that afternoon because that's what I do. September 21, 1887. 7070 head sick calves sold clearance lot Boak Auction Yard, Bitter Creek. Buyer one Apache woman, name unknown. Price $6 cash plus 2 wool blankets est. Value $20.24. Buyer's evident expectation of survival unknown. General opinion of observers 0 chance. I added a personal note at the bottom of the entry, the kind I wasn't supposed to include in syndicate ledgers but had been sneaking in for years. Something about the way she counted them. Twice. Like she already knew they were hers. I didn't follow her that day. I had my own obligations, 3 more operations to visit before week's end, none of them likely to provide happy numbers. But I asked around about her over the next few days, the way you do when something plants itself in your thinking and refuses to be moved. The name I got was Daya. Just the one name, though Chisovi, the old Apache man who ran a small trading operation out of a collapsed adobe building 12 miles southeast of Bitter Creek, told me later that she had a full name in her own language that translated roughly as the one who tends what others leave. He said it with a kind of affectionate resignation, like a man describing a family member's defining trait that has caused everyone considerable inconvenience. Her history, as I pieced it together from Chisovi and from Abelino, and from Dea herself on the 3 occasions when she spoke to me with any length about it, was this. She had been born to an Apache family in the northern reaches of what was then still contested territory, land that had been Apache for generations. That was in the process of becoming something else entirely through the mechanisms of treaty breaking and administrative fiction that characterized federal Indian policy in that era. Her father, a man named in Apache fashion but called by white traders Benito, had been one of the last of his family's traditional medicine people, not a war leader, not a shaman in the theatrical sense that dime novel writers preferred, but a practical healer, a man who had spent his life learning what the land could do for living things and applying that knowledge with the precision of a craftsman. Daya had learned from him. This was not unusual for a daughter in her family's tradition. Medicine knowledge was not exclusively the province of men, and her father had recognized early that she had a quality of attention that few people possessed. She could watch something struggling, an animal, a plant, a person, and identify not just that it was struggling, but how and why and what the struggle was trying to tell her about what the organism needed. Her father died of a fever himself, which I've always found grimly ironic. Not the pale fever, this was years earlier. Something that came through the camp in a wet spring and took 3 elders and 2 children and Benito, who was 61 years old and had spent his life treating the sick. He left Daya his blankets and his knowledge and a quarter section of land that a sympathetic territorial judge had registered in her name on the grounds that, and I'm quoting the actual legal document here, which I saw a copy of, the applicant demonstrates sufficient agricultural intent to merit consideration under modified homestead provisions. What this meant in practice was that she had a piece of land nobody else wanted, title to which was continuously contested by neighbors who wanted the water rights and the government agents who wanted everything. She'd been running a small operation on that land for 4 years by the time I met her. A kitchen garden, some dry-farmed corn and beans, 2 horses, and a few head of mixed cattle that she'd accumulated 1 or 2 at a time through trades and careful purchasing. She was not wealthy by any measure. She was not even comfortable. What she was stubborn in the particular way that people who have survived considerable loss become stubborn, not aggressive, not loud, but immovable. Like a rock that doesn't argue with water because it doesn't need to. The $6 she'd spent on those calves was close to everything she had in cash money. I learned this later. At the time, I simply knew what I'd seen. A woman buying dying animals with a deliberateness that suggested she was not operating on hope. Abelino was the one who told me what she did next, because his spread, the Castaneda operation, a small family outfit running a modest herd on leased land 2 miles from Daya's quarter section, backed up against her fence line, and he'd watched what happened over the next 10 days with the particular attention of a man who has nothing better to do than observe his neighbor's apparent madness. She didn't bring the calves home immediately. This surprised me when I heard it. 70 sick animals, some of them barely standing, and she left them in Boak's yard for an additional day and a half. When I eventually asked her why, she said simply, "I needed to prepare the place first." What she meant by this, I came to understand gradually, was something more systematic than I had initially assumed. The quarter section her father had acquired was cut by a seasonal creek that ran good water from late summer snowmelt through early November, then dried to a series of pools that lasted into December most years. The land itself was typical high desert, bunchgrass and juniper rocky soil that resisted a plow, but held moisture longer than the surrounding terrain because of a subtle clay sublayer that most people wouldn't notice unless they'd spent years watching how that particular piece of earth behaved in rain. Dea had spent years watching it. In the day and a half before the calves arrived, she remade the creekside pasture. She pulled the fence lines back from the water's edge, not far, just enough to allow the sick animals access to water without crowding and without having to fight for it. She cut fresh juniper branches and laid them along the fence lines, which Abelino told me smelled like something sharp and clean, a smell he associated with the high country. She dug shallow channels from the creek to two low-lying areas in the pasture, creating what were effectively small wallowing pools, not deep enough to drown anything, but deep enough for an animal to lie down in cool mud, which is what sick cattle will do when they're allowed to. And she went out before dawn and came back with things she'd gathered. Abelino described it as bundles, dried plants mostly, some fresh ones, bark from trees he couldn't identify. He said she moved through the gathering with the efficiency of someone executing a known procedure, not improvising. She wasn't improvising, she was doing something she'd learned. When the calves arrived, Boke's nephew drove them out in a makeshift temporary pen on a borrowed wagon, clearly convinced he was delivering corpses. Abelino said Dea walked among them for over an hour before she did anything else. Just walked among them slowly, not pushing or directing, just being present while they adjusted to the new space. She was watching. That quality of attention her father had seen in her. She was exercising it now, reading 70 sick animals the way a musician reads a score. She was identifying which ones were the sickest, prioritizing. The treatment she applied was not one thing. This is important, and I want to be clear about it because in subsequent years, when the story of Dea's calves became the kind of tale that gets simplified in the telling, people wanted it to be one thing, one remedy, one secret, one piece of Apache medicine that explained everything. It was never one thing. Her father had taught her that living things don't fail from one cause. They fail when multiple systems are overwhelmed simultaneously, and recovery requires attending to multiple systems simultaneously. What I know of what she did, I know from watching her myself on the 4 visits I made to her quarter section over the following 3 weeks, and from what she told me in those brief, precise conversations, and from what Abelino observed from across the fence line. She kept them cool. The wallowing pools served this purpose for the worst cases, the calves with the highest fevers, the ones whose breathing was most labored. She would guide them individually to the mud and let them settle there, and she'd sit beside them, sometimes for hours, watching their breathing slow and their eyes clear fractionally as their body temperatures came down. This is not mysterious. This is basic fever management, known to anyone who spent time nursing sick livestock. The knowledge is not secret. The application of it, consistently and patiently across 70 animals simultaneously, is extraordinary. She kept them hydrated. The creek access was part of this. She also, and this is where I'll admit I don't have a complete accounting, administered something in the water that she drew from the creek into a stone basin she kept near the center of the pasture. Abelino said the water had a faint color to it, golden-greenish, and a smell that he described as medicinal without being able to be more specific. She would move through the sick calves twice daily with this water, offering it from a clay bowl to the ones too weak to walk to the creek themselves. I asked her once about the water. She considered my question for a long moment, with that quality of stillness she had. My father knew which plants strengthen blood, she said. He knew which ones fight the infection that makes fever. He spent 40 years learning which ones work and which ones do not. I spent 20 years learning from him. A pause. The plants are here, they have always been here. This land has what is needed. I wrote that down. I've thought about it many times since. She kept them calm. This sounds small, and it isn't. Sick animals under stress die faster. The physiological mechanisms of stress response actively compromise immune function, a fact that veterinary science would not formally articulate for several more decades, but that anyone who'd spent a lifetime with animals understood intuitively. Dea moved among her calves slowly and without urgency. She did not shout. She did not push. She spoke to them in Apache, in a continuous low murmur that I could hear when I stood near the pasture fence. Not the soothing nonsense talk that most ranchers use with animals, but something more structured, more deliberate, as if she was explaining something. When I asked about this, she said, "My father said animals understand distress even when they cannot understand words. If you bring calm, they receive calm. If you bring fear, they receive fear." She paused. "Bring what you want them to have." But here is where I have to stop describing competence and start describing the weight of what she was doing. Because the weight was enormous, and she was carrying it mostly alone, and I don't want the technical accounting to obscure the human fact. She was sleeping 3 hours a night, maybe 4 on a good night. I could see it in her face on my second visit, 6 days after the calves arrived, the particular hollowness around the eyes, the slight delay in her responses, the way she'd lose a sentence mid-construction and have to find it again. She was running on will and caffeine, the latter from a bitter bark tea she kept in a clay pot near the fire. She had no help. Her nearest Apache neighbors were 8 miles distant. The surrounding white ranchers were either too busy with their own catastrophes or too committed to dismissiveness to offer assistance. And there was the additional layer of the particular brutality of that era's racial geography, which meant that a 26-year-old Apache woman asking a white rancher for help with livestock would have received, in most cases, a response somewhere between cold refusal and active hostility. Abelino brought her food twice. He told me this with a kind of awkward casualness that suggested he was aware of the social risk of it, a Tejano hand helping an Apache woman on contested land, but that he'd done it anyway because he had, in his words, seen what she was trying to do, and it seemed like something a person shouldn't have to do entirely alone. He brought beans and dried beef the first time. The second time he brought both and also, without comment, an extra rope for managing the sick calves that needed to be moved to the mud pools. Dea said thank you both times, Abelino told me, in a way that was straightforward and without performance. She didn't make a thing of it. I want to dwell on the financial reality for a moment, because it sits underneath everything else, and I think it has to be understood. Those $6 and the blankets were not a casual outlay. They were not the calculated risk of a person with resources. They were the calculated risk of a person with almost nothing, who had spent 20 years learning something specific, and who looked at a pen of dying animals that nobody else wanted and saw something that nobody else saw. If the calves died, all of them, most of them, enough of them, she lost not just the money and the blankets but the labor of 3 weeks, the plants she'd gathered, the sleep she'd sacrificed, and the credibility she'd been building in that basin as a person whose judgment could be trusted. In a territory where an Apache woman's property and livelihood were continuously at legal and physical risk, credibility wasn't an abstract social good. It was part of the infrastructure of survival. She was not a romantic figure gambling on a dream. She was a precise person making a calculated bet with everything she had, on the basis of knowledge she'd spent her entire life accumulating, in a situation where being wrong meant a kind of ruin that she'd have to survive with no net underneath her. This is the context inside which she spent 3 weeks sleeping 4 hours a night, and moving through 70 sick calves twice a day with a bowl of treated water and an inexhaustible patience. On the 8th day, 3 calves died. I wasn't there. Abelino told me. He said he saw her in the pre-dawn dark going into the pasture with a lantern, and when she came back out an hour later, she sat on the fence rail for a long time without moving. He didn't speak to her. He said the occasion didn't call for it. In the morning, she was back in the pasture, moving through the remaining 67 with the same measured attention. Not faster, not harder, the same. I asked her about those 3, eventually. It was one of the few times I saw something in her face that wasn't entirely contained. 3 died, she said. Yes. A pause. My father said you cannot save everything. You must not let what you could not save stop you from saving what you still can. Another pause, shorter. He was right. He was also not here to say it to me directly that morning, which made it harder to hear. 67 calves, the 67 that remained. By day 12, 31 of them were standing steady and eating. The fever symptoms were reduced or gone. They were not fully recovered. Recovery would take weeks more, but they were past the crisis. They were going to live. By day 19, when I made my 4th visit to her quarter section, 58 calves were on their feet and feeding normally. The remaining 9 were still weak but improved. None of them were dying. I stood at the fence and I counted them, old habit. Then I counted them again. I thought about Dea at the auction yard, standing in that pen, counting those same animals twice with one finger moving through the air. I thought she already knew. Not that they would all survive. She hadn't known that 3 hadn't, but she'd known something else. She'd known what she was looking at. She'd known the difference between dying and dead, understood it in a way that nobody else in that yard had bothered to apply. Every rancher who'd written those calves off had made a decision without investigating, had seen sick and translated it immediately to lost, skipping the middle question entirely. Lost to what? And can that be addressed? Dea had not skipped the question. She'd bought the question for $6 and 2 blankets, and answered it with 20 years of inherited knowledge and 3 weeks of 4-hour nights. I took out my ledger. I crossed out what I'd written on September 21st, general opinion of observers, 0 chance, and wrote below it, 6770 surviving as of October 10. Correction, observer was wrong. Outside, the pale fever was still moving through the basin. The distances between operational ranches were growing. At night, from Dea's fence line, you could sometimes see the distant glow of burning, herds culled and incinerated to prevent the spread of disease, a desperate measure that some ranchers had begun adopting in the 2nd month. The burning was not contained. The burning was not working. But in Dea's creekside pasture, in the cooling October air, 67 calves that everyone had condemned were on their feet and eating. And she was finally, that evening, for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, sitting still. She sat by the creek with her back against a juniper, her knees drawn up, her eyes moving over the pasture with that quality of attention that I'd seen the first day at the auction yard. She had a cup of the bitter bark tea. She was not smiling exactly, but there was something in her face, not triumph, nothing so clean as that, something quieter and more complicated. I asked if I could sit. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She moved slightly to indicate that the space beside her existed. I sat. We watched the calves for a while. They were calm. The evening had that particular quality of high desert autumn, dry and cool, the kind of air that feels like water when you breathe it, the juniper smell rising around us as the temperature dropped. My father, Dea said, after a while without preface, used to say that the hardest part of healing is not the knowledge. The hardest part is being willing to act on the knowledge when everyone around you is certain you are wrong. She didn't look at me when she said it. I wrote it down later when I got back to where I was staying. I write things down. It's a nervous tick dressed up as scholarship. But that one I kept separate from the ledger. Some things shouldn't be in a lost column. The basin started talking about Dea's calves around the 3rd week of October, which was also the week the pale fever reached what the territorial papers would later call its apex mortality period. A phrase that sounds almost elegant until you understand what it means, which is that people were losing everything, in the most literal sense available to them, and they were losing it fast. I was at the Tilghman Creek station when I first heard her name said with something other than dismissal. The station was a mail relay point, an informal gathering place, one of those regional nodes where news pooled and circulated with the particular velocity of information in a sparsely populated territory, where a piece of knowledge might take 4 days to travel 40 miles, but once it arrived, would saturate every conversation within hours. There were 7 men there when I stopped in for the midday meal. 2 ranchers, a postal rider, a supply freighter, a land surveyor who'd been stuck for 3 days waiting for a companion, and 2 hands from the Ridgeway operation who'd been sent to collect a parts shipment that hadn't arrived. The Ridgeway hands were the ones who mentioned it first. They'd passed near Dea's quarter section 2 days earlier, and one of them, a young man named Cord, maybe 20 years old with the permanent squint of someone who works outdoors in high desert country, had stopped and looked over the fence line. Healthy calves, he said, with the particular emphasis of a man for whom the phrase had become paradoxical. I'm telling you, standing straight, eating no fever walk on a single one. The freighter didn't believe him. Neither did one of the ranchers, the one named Hargreave, who I'd seen at the auction and who had, in the intervening month, lost 43 head of his own cattle. His face had the particular expression of a man for whom hope had become a form of danger. Someone who'd been hurt enough by expecting good things that he'd decided the most reliable defense was to disbelieve all of them. Apache woman, Hargreave said, with a flatness I recognized as a social preparation for dismissal. "Yes, sir," said Cord. Hargreave made a sound and looked at his coffee. But the land surveyor, a slight, precise-looking man from Massachusetts named Everett Price, who had been noting things in a small notebook throughout the meal, looked up and asked, "How many head did she have in?" 67 last I counted, Cord said. "Maybe more, I wasn't over the fence." Price wrote something in his notebook. He had the focused stillness of a man whose profession requires him to measure things carefully before drawing conclusions, and I recognized in him a kinship with Dea's quality of attention, though his was more methodical and less innate. "The lot from Boak's yard," I said, from across the table. I hadn't intended to contribute to the conversation, but the words came out before the decision to say them finished forming. Everyone looked at me. "I was there when she bought them," I said. "September 21st, 70 head, 6 stock clearance lot. She paid $6 and 2 blankets." The silence that followed was the specific silence of men revising their mental models in real time. "She's kept them alive?" Price asked. 67 of them," I said. "As of 10 days ago." Hargreave put his coffee down with a sound that was almost gentle. "How?" It was not a question exactly. It was the word that comes out of a person when something they'd written off as impossible has demonstrated that it is possible, and they don't yet have a frame to put it in. "I asked her that," I said. "She told me her father taught her what the land has for sick animals, that the plants have been here for a very long time and some of them fight the infection." Another silence. "Herbal," said one of the ranchers with a faint contempt that I suspected was habitual rather than considered. The social reflex of a man who has been taught that certain kinds of knowledge are primitive and has never examined why he was taught that. "Effective," I said. The word came out flatter than I intended. I picked up my fork. Price was still writing. The scratch of his pencil in the notebook was the only sound in the room for a moment. "Has anyone else tried to replicate it?" he asked. Nobody had thought to ask. I have thought a great deal in the years since about why nobody asked. The answer, when I turn it over carefully, is not simple and not comfortable. This is how you lose access to useful knowledge, not through malice necessarily, through categorization. Part of it was also fear. By October, the pale fever had achieved the psychological status of an unstoppable force, something that moved according to its own logic, indifferent to human effort. People had tried things, quarantine, culling, moving herds to different pastures. None of it had worked reliably, and the repeated failure of effort had produced in the ranching population a particular demoralization that presented itself as pragmatism. "There's nothing to be done," said with a firm jaw and steady eyes, because firm jaws and steady eyes were the required performance of that time and that geography. But underneath, I cannot try one more thing and watch it fail. To look at Dea's calves, healthy in their pasture, was to see evidence that something could be done. And for some of those men, that evidence was harder to absorb than the alternative, because if something could be done, if there was knowledge out there that worked, then all the animals they'd lost, all the losses they'd already accepted, were not the result of unstoppable force. They were the result of not knowing something. And not knowing something when someone nearby knew it is a different and more difficult category of loss. This is what I'm saying. Some of those men could not afford to believe in Dea's calves, because believing in them would have required feeling things about their own losses that they didn't have the resources to feel. I understood this. I also found it then and now deeply sad. The man who came to her fence line first was not a rancher. He was the Apache man, Chisovy, who ran the small trading operation 12 miles southeast. He arrived on a piebald horse on a Thursday morning in the last week of October, which I know because I happened to be making my 5th visit to Dea's quarter section at the time. By then, I had more or less abandoned the pretense of ledger work and was simply coming out to observe, with the awareness that I was watching something worth recording. Chisovy was older than I'd expected, maybe 70, with a face so deeply weathered it seemed topographic, and eyes that held the specific calm of a person who has outrun enough things to have stopped looking over his shoulder. He spoke to Dea in Apache for nearly an hour while I sat on the fence rail at a respectful distance and watched the calves graze. I couldn't follow the language, but I could follow the conversation in the way that emotional content translates across language barriers. I could hear the exchange move from greeting to something more serious to something that involved extended quiet, and then back to something warmer. When Chisovi came to speak to me, he had functional English, careful and accented like Dea's. I asked what they'd discussed. He gave me a long, evaluating look, the kind that is not hostile but is thorough. I told her what her father would say, he said. I waited. He would say, now they will come. He said it without inflection, not prophecy, not pride, just an observation. A man stating something he's known long enough that it no longer requires emphasis. I asked if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Chisovi thought about this with the same quality of deliberateness that Dea brought to everything. It is what it is, he said finally. The knowledge is worth more than the people who want it believe. Now they will discover this. What they do when they discover it. He looked out over the pasture for a moment. That is always the question. He left before noon. Dea watched him ride out with an expression I wasn't able to read clearly. Something that contained fondness and something else, quieter, that I thought might have been apprehension. The second person who came was Hargreave. He arrived the following Monday, on foot, having walked the 2.5 miles from the road rather than ride to her gate. I don't know if this was deliberate, a gesture of approach without the imposition of formal arrival, or if it was simply the reflexive habit of a man who had grown up in a culture where arriving on horseback at someone's gate uninvited had specific social meanings that arriving on foot didn't carry. He stood at her fence line for a while before she came out. I was not there for this. Abelino told me about it afterward, with that particular quality of narration that a man adopts when he's describing something he found unexpectedly moving, but doesn't want to characterize as such. Hargreave had lost, by that point, 51 of his 68 head. He had 2 remaining healthy cattle and 15 sick ones, and the 15 sick ones were getting worse. His wife had gone to stay with her sister in Raton 2 weeks earlier and had not returned. His 2 hands had quit, not in anger, just in the quiet way that men leave situations with no future, and he'd been managing what was left alone. He stood at Dea's fence in his coat, which Abelino said was a good coat, but showed evidence of not having been brushed recently, and he watched the healthy calves in the pasture. He watched them for a long time. When Dea came out, she'd seen him from a distance, Abelino thought, because she came at the kind of deliberate pace that suggests awareness rather than surprise. Hargreave didn't speak immediately. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands in front of him. He looked at the calves. Then he looked at Dea. I have 15 sick head, he said. I watched you buy those calves at Boak's yard and I thought you were. He stopped. He looked down at his hat. I was wrong about what I thought. Dea said nothing. She waited. I don't have $6, Hargreave said. I have $2 and some goods, and I don't. He stopped again. This stopping, Abelino said, was not the stopping of a man searching for words, but the stopping of a man struggling with something more fundamental. The effort of asking for something from someone you've categorized as not requiring your respect, and discovering that the categorization was wrong, and having to remake yourself slightly in real time to accommodate the correction. I would like to know, Hargreave said finally, if you would tell me what you've done for my animals, what you've done for yours. Dea looked at him for a long moment. The calves I purchased are not well enough yet to be separated from this pasture, she said. But I can show you the plants. I can show you how to prepare the water treatment. I can show you the principles my father taught. Hargreave's jaw moved slightly, the kind of movement that happens when a person is preventing a different expression from emerging. Why, he said, and then with visible difficulty, why would you help me, after? He didn't finish the sentence. After wasn't a word that needed completion. After was a very long history compressed into 3 letters. Dea was quiet for a moment that Abelino, observing from his fence line, described as feeling substantial. Because my father did not say, teach only those who have treated you well, she said. He said, teach those who are willing to learn there is a difference. A pause. Also, your animals did not do anything to me. They are sick. They should not stay sick because their owner was foolish. Abelino, telling me this story, laughed at that last sentence, not unkindly, but with the appreciation of a man who values precise language. Hargreave didn't laugh, but he put his hat back on, which Abelino said, in the body language of a man like Hargreave, was the equivalent of an extended expression of gratitude. Dea spent 3 hours with Hargreave that afternoon. I pieced together the content of that conversation from what Hargreave told people later, and from what Dea herself told me in fragments over subsequent weeks. It was not a simple transmission of information. It was more complicated than that, because what Dea knew was not a list of ingredients and instructions. It was a framework, a way of looking at sick animals that required understanding certain principles before the specific techniques made any sense. The first principle she told him was this: an animal fighting fever is spending energy it needs to spend on fighting the infection. Anything you can do to reduce the additional cost, heat, stress, the effort of seeking water, gives the animal more resources for the actual fight. This is why the mud pools mattered. This is why the calm mattered, not as comfort as strategy. The second principle was this: the fever is a response, not the disease. The fever is the animal system detecting the infection and mounting a defense. Reducing the fever too aggressively, which some ranchers had attempted with various compounds, can actually interfere with the defense. The goal is to support the system, not suppress the response. The third principle was the one that had required 40 years for her father to develop and 20 years for her to inherit: which plants, in that specific territory, contained compounds that could support the immune response against this specific type of infection. This was not improvisation. This was accumulated empirical knowledge, the result of a family tradition of careful observation across multiple generations, watching what worked and what didn't, documenting it in the oral tradition's equivalent of clinical notes. Hargreave listened. Abelino, who'd come over by then because the social situation had shifted enough to make this seem natural rather than intrusive, listened too. Hargreave asked questions. Some of them were good questions. Some of them revealed the assumptions I'd identified earlier, the reflex toward skepticism about knowledge that came from outside the institutions he recognized as legitimate sources of expertise. But he asked them, and Dea answered them with neither condescension nor defensiveness, and when the questions revealed assumptions she thought were wrong, she said so directly and explained why. "My father's father," she said at one point, "treated animals with fever in this territory for 50 years. My father treated them for 40 years. I have treated them for 4. That is 100 years of practice on these lands with these plants and these animals. A university teaches its medicine in 4 years. She paused. I have more practice. Hargreave was quiet. The practice is good, he said finally. It came out as a simple acknowledgement, which was, I think, all it needed to be. What Dea gave Hargreave that afternoon was not a recipe. It was more and less than that. It was an introduction to a way of thinking that he could, if he chose, begin to apply with the plants she'd identified and the principles she'd outlined. Some of what she'd used, he couldn't replicate. Her years of practice had given her a quality of observation and response that couldn't be transferred in an afternoon conversation. She could read a sick animal's state in 15 minutes. Hargreave would need considerably longer to arrive at even a rough approximation of the same assessment. She could adjust her treatment day by day based on what she was observing. He would be working from a cruder and more static understanding. But the core of it, the plants, the preparation, the management principles, those she could give him, and she did. Abelino walked out with Hargreave when he left. He told me that the man walked differently than he'd arrived, not lighter exactly, but differently weighted. Like a man who has had a burden redistributed rather than removed, still carrying it, but carrying it differently. 12 of Hargreave's 15 sick calves survived. He told people afterward that he owed Dea the debt of his operation, which, given the man and his context, was a statement with considerable weight. He did not, at that point, fully articulate what he owed her beyond that, the specific accounting that included his assumption at the auction yard, his initial categorization of her knowledge as unlikely to be worth engaging. That accounting came later, and by different increments. But the beginning of it started when he walked away from her fence line with the information she'd given him. 3 more ranchers came within the week. Then 6 more. By the first week of November, there was a worn track between the county road and Dea's gate where there had been no track before. Abelino said it appeared like a creek appears after heavy rain, suddenly, inevitably, as if it had always been there waiting for the conditions to make it manifest. The conversations at the fence line had a common shape. They arrived with the particular posture of people who are not accustomed to asking for help and who are managing various layers of discomfort about asking for help from this specific person. They left with varying degrees of the same thing Hargreave had left with, something redistributed. Not all of them recovered their cattle. The ones who came later, whose animals were further into the illness, had less margin to work with. The principles helped, but they were not magic, and Dea never presented them as such. 3 ranchers who came to her fence line lost every animal they had, despite applying what she'd told them as well as they understood it. She told me about one of them, a quiet young man in his mid-20s who'd inherited the operation from his father the previous year, and had no reserves of any kind, financial or experiential, with a specific sadness that she carried in her voice like a stone she'd picked up and couldn't quite put down. He did everything correctly, she said. He understood, he applied the knowledge carefully. The animals were simply too far along, there was not enough left to save. A pause. I think he knew, she said. When he came, I think he already knew there was probably not enough time, but he came anyway. Why? I asked. She considered this. Because, she said slowly, sometimes you do not come to be saved. Sometimes you come to be seen, to have someone look at what you are trying to do and acknowledge that it was worth trying. Another pause. My father treated patients who did not recover. He said the treatment was still worth doing, not because it always works, because a person in extremity should not be left alone in it. I wrote that in the ledger and then immediately crossed it out and put it in the separate section. Some accounting shouldn't be mixed with the loss columns. November arrived, and with it the first real cold, which the basin's remaining ranchers greeted with relief that bordered on reverence. Cold slowed the fever's transmission. Not stopped it, but slowed it enough to make the distinction between this week and next week mean something. By the middle of the month, the shape of the pale fever's arc was becoming visible. The tallies were staggering, over 11,000 head lost in a 40-mile radius, as I mentioned. But within those tallies there were now anomalies, pockets of survival that didn't fit the fever's general pattern of comprehensive devastation. Some of them were attributable to early quarantine or fortunate positioning. Some of them were attributable to Dea. Price, the surveyor from Massachusetts, had stayed in the basin through November on the basis that the survey work he'd come to do was impossible until spring anyway, and had turned his methodical attention to documenting the fever's impact. He came to me in the second week of November with his small notebook and asked if I could introduce him to Dea, which I did. He spent 2 days at her quarter section, asking questions with the careful precision of a man trained in the documentation of observable phenomena. He was respectful in a way that was somewhat different from the other visitors, not the complicated respect of people remaking their assumptions under pressure, but the simpler respect of someone who has never learned to disregard certain kinds of knowledge in the first place, because his training didn't include the particular biases of frontier ranching culture. When he left, he told me he intended to write a paper. Something for a natural history journal in the East, a documentation of the plants, the treatment principles, the outcomes data. He asked if Dea would consent to be the primary informant and to have her father's knowledge attributed to her by name. I brought this proposal to Dea. She was quiet with it for a longer time than she was usually quiet with things. A paper, she said. In a journal, Eastern, natural history or something adjacent to it. She was looking out over the pasture. The calves were heavy-bodied now, fully recovered, their coats thick with early winter growth. They moved with the particular unhurried authority of healthy cattle in good pasture. My father's knowledge written down, she said, not a question. More like she was examining the concept from various angles. Your knowledge, I said, with attribution to the tradition you learned from. Another long quiet. My father kept his knowledge in memory, she said. As his father kept it, memory is fragile, I have thought sometimes, she stopped. I have thought that written down things survive differently than remembered things. They can reach people who were not there, people who come later. She said this with a complicated expression that I've spent years trying to accurately describe. There was something in it that was satisfaction, or maybe relief, the recognition that the knowledge, once written, would be harder to lose. But there was something else, too. Something that understood the cost of that kind of survival. The way knowledge, when it passes into a different system, is also changed by the passage. Flattened, categorized, made legible in ways that alter it. She agreed to talk to Price. She stipulated one condition, that her father's name, his Apache name, in its full form, appear in the attribution. Price agreed without hesitation. The paper was published 18 months later in a Philadelphia natural history journal. It reached, I was told, a modest but interested audience in the scientific community. Whether it changed anything material in how that community thought about indigenous botanical knowledge, I genuinely don't know. These things move slowly. They move in circles. Sometimes they don't move at all. But the paper existed. Dea's father's name was in it. The knowledge was written down. Some things survive differently when they're written. The last sick calf on the basin died in the first week of December. Not one of Dea's, one of Hargreaves, the 3 he'd lost from the 15 she'd tried to help save. He buried it himself in the frozen ground with what I was told was a particular set to his jaw that people who'd known him a long time recognized as grief-coded as industry, working through the feeling rather than at it. The pale fever didn't end so much as exhaust itself. The cold killed the vectors that carried it. The herds it hadn't taken were too reduced to sustain continued transmission. By December, it had moved through the basin like a fire through cured grass, fast and total, and leaving a landscape that was recognizable in outline but stripped of most of what had made it what it was. The accounting, when it was finalized, was as follows. In the Cimarron Basin and the surrounding drainage, the pale fever of 1887 destroyed approximately 70% of the cattle population. 43 ranching operations failed entirely in the subsequent 6 months, not from the fever directly, but from the compounding consequences. Lost income, bank debt that couldn't be serviced, the psychological collapse that follows total loss and makes recovery feel not just difficult but theoretically impossible. 22 of those operations were abandoned outright. The families left. Some of them went back east, some went further west. A few simply vanished into the territory's enormous anonymous geography, which has its own kind of mercy. The ranchers who survived mostly did so by combination of luck, early action, and in some cases what they privately attributed to what Dea had taught them. Nobody made this attribution publicly. The cultural moment was not quite ready for that. The recognition of Apache medical knowledge as legitimate expertise that had saved operations was real, experienced, undeniable to the people who had experienced it. But the public language for naming it in those terms didn't yet exist in that world, in that year. Hargreave named it, not publicly, not formally, but he named it. He came to Dea's fence line a 3rd time in January when the fever was over, and the basin was in the particular suspended state that follows catastrophe, neither grieving nor recovering, but existing in the pause between them. He came on horseback this time, which meant something. He sat his horse at her gate for a minute before she came out. He told her that 12 of his 15 sick calves had survived. That without what she'd shown him, he was fairly certain all 15 would have died, along with the 2 healthy ones he'd pulled from the main pasture on her advice. That as things stood, he had 14 cattle total and some debt he was working to reorganize, and a wife who had come back from Raton when she heard the fever had broken. He told her he was sorry for what he'd been thinking at the auction yard in September. Not in general, specifically. The specific thought he'd had when she stood in the pen of sick calves and counted them, the thought that had crossed his face in the form of that flatness I'd noticed. Dea listened to this without interrupting. She had a way of receiving an apology that neither deflected it nor made more of it than it was. She just let it arrive and settle, the way you let something heavy set down, giving it its full weight. "My father said," she told him when he'd finished, "that the best students are the ones who discover they were wrong and use the discovery to see differently, not to feel bad about what they saw before, to see differently from now on." Hargreave nodded. He looked at the cattle in the pasture for a moment, 67 animals, grown now into the particular self-possession of healthy young stock, their coats thick and winter rough, their breathing even in the cold air. 67, he said. Yes. He looked at them a moment longer. Then he touched his hat brim and rode back down the track toward the county road. I have been circling around something, and I think it is time to come at it directly. In the weeks after the fever ended, as the basin began its halting attempt at recovery, I found myself returning to Dea's quarter section with a frequency that had passed beyond the professional justification I'd been using as cover. The ledger work was done. The syndicate reports were filed. There was nothing requiring my presence in the basin anymore, and nothing requiring me specifically to keep finding reasons to sit at Dea's fence line with my journal open on my knee. I kept finding reasons. Part of it was the story. I'm a person who records things, and what I had witnessed over the preceding 3 months was something I felt obscurely responsible for getting right. Not for publication, perhaps not for any audience beyond myself, but gotten right in the way that matters to people with my particular nervous tic. The story of what Dea had done, what she'd known, how she'd done it. I felt it deserving of accurate documentation by someone who had been adjacent to it as it happened. But part of it was simpler and more embarrassing. I was not entirely certain what I was observing in Dea, and I could not stop trying to understand it. This is not a romantic statement. It is a more fundamental one. I had spent 19 years in ranching country watching people respond to hard conditions, and in all of that time I had developed what I believed was a reasonable taxonomy of human responses to difficulty. The brittle ones and the stubborn ones and the broken ones and the enduring ones. I thought I had a working model. Dea didn't fit the model. Or rather, she fitted in a way that required me to expand the model considerably, and I kept returning to examine the expansion. What I mean is this: she was not resilient in the way I'd been trained to recognize resilience, the triumphant version, the one that announces itself and makes clear that it has survived. She was resilient in a quieter, and I came to think more accurate way. She simply had not organized her sense of herself around the possibility of defeat. Not because she was unaware of it. She was aware of it. The 3 calves that had died, she carried them. The knowledge that everything she'd done might have failed, she'd carried that too, through 3 weeks of 4-hour nights, carrying it lightly enough to function but not putting it down. She had a different relationship with precariousness than most people I'd met. She lived in precariousness. Her land tenure was contested, her resources were minimal, her legal standing in the territory was compromised by a dozen overlapping policies that were actively hostile to Apache land ownership. And she didn't resolve the precariousness by pretending it didn't exist. She resolved it by becoming very good at operating within it. This is not the same thing as courage. Courage implies the overcoming of fear. What Dea had was more useful, a refusal to treat fear as information she had to act on immediately, paired with a very clear understanding of what she actually knew and what the knowledge was worth. I thought about her at the auction yard constantly, the twice counting, the deliberateness, the way she had looked at those dying calves and seen not their current state but their potential state, given specific interventions, and had been able to make that assessment accurately enough to bet $6 and 2 irreplaceable blankets on it. That is a specific kind of intelligence. It has nothing to do with formal education, institutional credentialing, or any of the systems that the world I'd come from used to sort knowledge from ignorance. It has to do with quality of attention, depth of practice, and the willingness to trust what you know when everyone around you is certain you're wrong. I wrote a lot of this in my journal, more than I usually write. In February, I finally asked her the question I'd been carrying since September. We were sitting by the creek, the same spot where I'd sat with her that first evening after the 67th calf had stood on its feet. The creek was low, winter-thin, moving with the particular quiet clarity of cold water. The calves were in the far pasture, a distance away, the kind of healthy distance that means they don't need attending. I asked her if she'd been afraid. She looked at the creek. When, she said. At the yard, when you bought them, or after, when you were 3 weeks in and 3 had died and the rest were. Yes, she said, simple, without drama. What did you do with it? She considered the creek for a while. My father said fear is correct information, she said finally. It tells you that something important is at stake. If you feel no fear, either nothing is at stake or you have not yet understood what is. A pause. But fear is only correct about that one thing. It does not tell you whether to proceed or retreat. It does not tell you whether you will succeed or fail. It only tells you that what you are doing matters. Another pause, longer. So I felt the fear and I understood what it was telling me, that this mattered, and then I did the work. The creek moved past us in the cold. That sounds simple, I said. It is simple, she said. It is not easy. Simple things are rarely easy. She looked at me sideways, the first time in our acquaintance that I had experienced her as having a sense of humor, quiet and dry as juniper smoke. I think you know this. You write things down all the time. You think recording them makes them easier to understand. I opened my mouth. "Does it?" she asked. I looked at my journal, then at the creek, then at the calves in the far pasture, substantial and winterwooled and entirely, improbably alive. "Sometimes," I said, "sometimes it just shows me how much I don't understand." "Yes," she said, like this was the correct and expected answer, like she'd been waiting for me to arrive at it. The basin's recovery was slow and irregular, as these things always are. Some ranchers rebuilt. Hargreave was among them. He sold 2 of his recovered calves in the spring, used the money to buy 2 more, and began the patient long work of restocking from a foundation of 14. It would take him years. He was a stubborn man, which in his case was an asset. Others didn't rebuild. The mathematics of total loss, when combined with the debt obligations of frontier ranching operations, produced in many cases a gap too wide to cross. The banks were not sentimental. The land those ranchers had worked was absorbed by other parties, larger operations, land companies, in a few cases the territory itself, with the efficiency that attends the transfer of assets from the failed to the operational. The land companies, it should be noted, made several attempts over the following year to acquire Dea's quarter section. The water rights on her creekside pasture had become, after a season in which water access had been a factor in which calves survived, and which didn't, more evidently valuable than they'd previously seemed. The attempts were not friendly. They involved legal arguments about the validity of her title, about treaty provisions, about the authority of the territorial judge who'd registered the land in her name. Chisovi helped her navigate this. He knew a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man who had, for his own complicated reasons, made a practice of territorial land cases involving Apache and Navajo claimants. And this man took her case at a reduced rate and fought it with the particular tenacity of someone who had learned to enjoy this specific kind of fight. The title held barely, with conditions and contested provisions that would require continued vigilance, but it held. Dea told me about this with the same quality she brought to everything. The weight was there, fully acknowledged, but carried lightly enough to function. She had known the attacks were coming. She had prepared for them the way she prepared for everything, by knowing what she knew, building relationships with people whose knowledge complemented hers, and not wasting energy being surprised by what was predictable. "They want the water," she said. "Yes." "The fever showed what the water is worth," she said. It was not an observation about irony, I think. It was an observation about visibility, how the crisis had made legible things that had been there all along, both the value of the water and the threat to its ownership. I asked her if she regretted buying the calves, if she regretted the visibility it brought. She thought about this. "My father's knowledge saved animals this season," she said. "It will save animals in the next season if the knowledge is shared. More ranchers now know the plants. More ranchers know the principles." She paused. "The knowledge being spread is worth more than the inconvenience of the attention it brought. Even given the land threats." "I would face land threats regardless," she said simply. "I have faced them since I registered the title. The calves did not create the threat. They only changed who knows about me." Another pause. "It is better to be seen for what you actually are than to be invisible in ways that allow others to define you." I stayed in the basin through March. This was significantly longer than I'd planned, and my employer in Denver had sent 3 increasingly pointed letters requesting my return. I had responded to each with a version of nearly finished, circumstances unusual, which was technically accurate in the sense that I was still finding things to document, and the circumstances remained unusual. The truth was simpler. I was not ready to leave. I have spent a great deal of time since examining this reluctance, and I am reasonably sure I understand it. I had been 19 years in ranching country as a ledger man, a tallier of what exists against what was promised, a documenter of outcomes, a person who arrives after things have happened and writes them into a record. This is useful work. It is not unimportant, but it is inherently backward-looking, which over time produces a particular quality of engagement with the world. You are always catching up to events, always a step behind the actual moment in which things are decided. Watching Dea had been the opposite experience. I had watched something as it happened, not after it happened, not its accounting, but the event itself, in the field in real time. I had watched a person in the act of applying knowledge to a crisis with the specific quality of attention and patience and accumulated practice that turned knowledge from theory into fact. I didn't want to go back to ledgers immediately. I wanted to sit with what I'd seen for a while longer. But I also had a more direct reason. I had asked Dea in late February whether she'd be willing to walk me through the plant identification that her father had taught her, not for Price's paper, which was already in draft, but for my own documentation. A field guide of sorts, organized around the principles she'd described, with notation of the specific preparations and their applications. She had been quiet with this request for 2 days. Then she said yes. We spent 6 mornings in March walking the land. She showed me 12 plants. She showed me how to identify them across their winter and early spring states, which are different from summer and significantly harder to read. She showed me the preparations, the drying methods, the bark stripping, the cold water extraction versus the warming method, the ratios that her father had refined over decades of application. She was a precise and thorough teacher. Not effusive, she didn't editorialize or celebrate what she was showing me. She showed me the thing, told me what she knew about it, answered questions with accuracy and without embellishment, and corrected my errors without softening the corrections. On the 5th morning, as we were working along the creek's north bank in an area where one of the key plants grew dense in the shade of overhanging rock, she said, without particular ceremony, "My father taught me as I am teaching you. He said, the knowledge is not mine to keep. It is mine to pass forward. If I keep it, it dies with me. If I pass it, it lives longer than I do." She didn't look at me when she said this. She was examining a plant stem, running her thumb along the underside of a leaf. "I am passing it to you," she said, "and to Price's paper, and to the ranchers who came to my fence line. It will reach further than it has before. Some of it will be garbled in the passing. Knowledge is always changed by translation." A pause. "But some of it will arrive intact. And the part that arrives intact will do work." I wrote this down, then I looked up at her. She was still examining the plant with the same quality of attention she'd had at the auction yard, the deep, patient observation that doesn't rush to conclusion. "Are you afraid of what happens to it?" I asked, "as it passes further from the source?" She considered this for a longer time than I expected. "My father was afraid of that," she said finally. "He was afraid that the knowledge removed from its context, from the land, from the practice, from the tradition of the people who developed it, would become something less than what it is, something flattened." A pause. "He was probably right to be afraid of that." She set the leaf down, looked at the creek. "But the alternative," she said, "is that it stays where it is and dies with me and helps no one, and that is worse." She paused. "The fever showed me this. The calves showed me this. Knowledge that stays contained is only useful to the person containing it. My father knew much more than I do, and when he died, most of it died with him. What he passed to me is a fraction." Her voice was steady, but the weight in it was audible, not grief exactly, not anymore, but the settled residue of it. "I will not make the same choice. I left in the first week of April. My last morning on the basin, I went to the quarter section one final time. Dea was in the creekside pasture with the calves, doing what she'd been doing since September, moving among them with that quality of attention, checking, observing. The calves were substantial now, the survivors of the winter, their coats beginning to shed the long winter growth in patches that gave them a ragged and slightly comical appearance. She saw me coming and finished what she was doing before she came to the fence. "Leaving today," I said. "Yes," she said, like she'd known. I had the field notes I'd made during our March walks, 9 pages in a handwriting considerably cleaner than my usual, with diagrams I'd attempted and corrections she'd made in the margins. I had my ledger with the September entry and the crossed-out note about 0 survival chances. I had 3 months of observation in a leather journal my mother had called a nervous tick. I told Dea I would write this up properly, that I would send her a copy, that I would, and here I ran into the limitations of the available language, that I would try to get it right. She looked at me with that quality of evaluating attention. "You will not get all of it right," she said. "No one does. The important thing is to be precise about what you know and what you do not know." "Yes," I said, "that's the important thing." A pause. The calves moved behind her in the morning light. "The ones who came to the fence line," I said, "will they come back?" She thought about this. "Some," she said, "the ones who understood what they learned. The ones who came only for the emergency," a slight pause. "People in a crisis will accept knowledge from any source. When the crisis is over, some of them return to their old sources. some do not. Which kind was Hargreave? She considered. He is still deciding, she said, not unkindly, as a simple observation of fact. He is an honest man who had dishonest assumptions. Honest men sometimes take a long time to renegotiate their assumptions fully, but they do it more thoroughly than men who are not honest. I got on my horse. The paper, I said, Price's paper when it comes out. Yes, she said. I hope it reaches the right people. She looked out over the pasture. The 67 calves. I counted them once more, out of habit. The same way I counted everything, moving in the April light with the uncomplicated health of things that have survived what was supposed to kill them. The right people, Dea said, are the ones who need to learn something and are willing to. Those people exist everywhere. A pause. The paper will reach some of them, the ranchers will tell some of them, you will write about some of them. She looked at me. That is how it spreads, not all at once. One person, then another, one piece at a time. She touched the fence rail once. Not a goodbye exactly, more a period at the end of a sentence. Then she turned back to her calves. I rode out along the track, now worn down to bare earth from months of visitors, and out onto the county road and north toward the rail connection at Raton. The morning was clear and hard, the particular quality of early spring in high desert that suggests winter is not quite finished with you, but has agreed provisionally to let you go. I didn't look back, not because I wasn't tempted, but because I developed, over the preceding months, a sense that some moments should be allowed to stay complete rather than extended by the backward glance that turns them into something smaller. What I knew as I rode north. 67 calves had survived a fever that had killed 11,000 in 40 miles. They had survived because a woman with $6 and 2 blankets and 20 years of inherited knowledge had looked at dying animals and seen what nobody else bothered to see, that dying is not the same as dead, and that the distance between them can be crossed if you know the terrain. This knowledge was older than the territory. It was older than the ranching operations that occupied the basin. It had been developed here, on this land, by people who had been attending to this land for generations longer than anyone in that auction yard had been alive. It had saved things, imperfectly, partially with loss alongside the survival, but it had saved things. And now it was in Price's paper, and in the notes of the ranchers who'd come to the fence line, and in my journal in my saddlebag, and most importantly in the 67 calves themselves, who were simply there, alive, evidence that something had worked. I thought about what Dea had said about knowledge passing forward, about the fraction her father had managed to pass to her, and how she was passing a fraction of that fraction forward, about how knowledge, moved through people and contexts and translations, becomes something slightly different from what it was, but carries the essential shape of it. The way a river, moving through different geographies, is always the same water even when it runs in different configurations. I thought about her at the auction yard, counting those calves twice. I thought she knew what she was buying, she knew what she had, she knew what the land had, and she bet everything on the combination. And then I stopped thinking about it and just rode in the cold April morning, with the notes in my bag and the leather journal and the crossed-out ledger entry that now read, in the margin beside it, correction, observer was wrong. Some things you write down because you need to understand them. Some things you write down so they survive you. I have been writing things down for 19 years, and I have never been certain which category applies in any given moment. That morning, riding north out of the Cimarron Basin in the spring of 1888, I was fairly certain I knew.